You just described I think the thing that gets me up in the morning
Oh,
with
really?
respect to my
Fantastic.
job, because,
Mhm.
well, that really is, so that's where the engineer never goes away.
Hello, and welcome to Biofilm Podcast, a show that brings you to the forefront of biomedical research, biotech, pharma, and healthcare fields, and the professionals behind it. I'm your host, Pavel. Today's guest is Mike Ouren. He's a chief sales engineer with Precise Automation, a company that specializes in manufacturing and deployment of industrial collaborative robots for a range of applications, including life science research and diagnostics. Throughout his life, Mike was fascinated with robots and now realizes his passion to bring these cutting-edge machines to the forefront of the fight against COVID-19. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thank you for having me, Pavel.
Thank you. Before we get started, Mike, I wanted to say thank you again very much for joining me today. And for our audience, I mentioned that we've met at one of our networking events online previously. And I realized that one of the topics of our conversation was how busy you are during this COVID-19 crisis. And sticking with the recurrent segment that I like to start up my podcast with, what was the recent movie that you had a chance to watch? And have you even had a chance to take a breather and actually enjoy something?
Nothing really recent as far as recent releases, but so I got on the topic with a friend of mine about a movie set that I actually worked on. And I wouldn't say the movie, I worked on, it was a very tiny effort, mainly, of course, surrounding robots. But it did get me to actually pull up the old movie and watch Terminator.
Oh, that is a classic.
Because I was on the movie set of Terminator 3, and I actually operated some robots that didn't actually end up making it into the final film. They made it into an extra scene that was put on the DVD. But the memory I have was I got to meet Arnold Schwarzenegger and actually hang out with him on the set. So that
No
was a lot of
way.
fun. And I'm 6'8", so he's 6 feet tall. So he kept giving me all the business about being so tall, because I was basically the same height as his bodyguard, who also does some work as a stand-in. So if you're not familiar with how movies, they'll often have a stand-in do rehearsals to get everything set up, and then they'll say the lines of the actor, and then of course when the showtime happens, that's when the actor comes in and they do their thing.
That is fantastic. I mean, this must be one of the highlights of your I guess entire life. I mean, at least it would be in my case.
Never thought when I first saw that movie in the 1980s that I would be hanging out with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And as an added bonus, I don't know why she was there, but Grace Jones was there. If you're familiar with Grace Jones, she was his co-star in Conan the Barbarian. So
Well,
I guess they're good friends or something like that.
That is phenomenal. I mean, that's why I guess I like to start my podcast with these types of questions, because you never know what kind of movie that people have seen or what kind of story they might associate, with a recent film that they might have seen. So that's really nice. So going back to, I guess, to the days of when you were on set of Terminator, obviously you've been trying to get into the career that has to do with electronics, robotics, and things like that, and cutting edge science. So where did the fascination with these types of things really come into your life? Like, what was the main inspiration that you found to jump into that field?
Well, my brother and I both had an opportunity that my parents afforded us, as it was, he's older than I am, and for him it was his junior year in high school, and 7 years later, since I'm 7 years younger than he is, it was a junior year of high school for me. And in fact, basically my parents said, "Hey, we're going to go on a trip. Where do you want to go?" It's like an international trip. That was the idea. Now I could have said, well, let's go somewhere in the U.S., but I wanted to go somewhere overseas. And at that time, I was fascinated with cars in many ways, especially just the German car manufacturing. And I wanted to see like where these really amazing machines came from. This is back in the early 90s, so cars there was a lot of excess, let's say, in cars at that time compared to now. The cars are a lot more efficient than they used to be. But back then, I mean, gas mileage was really not a big consideration. So my choice was, let's go to Germany and let's go tour some car factories. And so my first car factory I ever toured was a factory I've actually been back to as somebody, a working adult, was the BMW manufacturing plant in Munich, which is, the headquarters. Mm-hmm. And they have, they really go over the top in this great tour. We got to see all the robotics. And then I also saw the Mercedes factory in Sindelfingen, which is also very famous because the first commercial internal combustion engine is still there. And they still start it a couple of times a day to show people, this amazing single-cylinder engine that was used to power a car back in the 1900s.
Oh my gosh. How did you score that kind of trip? Like, did you have to make like arrangements to get there?
Yeah, there were a lot of plans to be made. I mean, mainly it was my dad. I grew up in a family of seasoned travelers. I think everybody was just geared to travel. We've always been that way. I'm, multi-generational sales family, right? So everyone in my family studied something outside of like business and something like that. My father was an agronomist. My great-grandfather was a electrical engineer that worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratories back during World War II when they were developing the atomic bomb. And so I've always had this exposure to technology and just the inspiration of science and how it can be applied. And I think that was just, it's really not a big deal for us. And still, and for me, I pride myself on the fact that sans COVID-19 regulations, I will hop on a plane on a regular basis, usually 5-6 times a year, and go to Europe usually to work with customers there because the robotics field is an international one. Yeah. But I think I wouldn't have had that inspiration if it weren't for that upbringing of being around a bunch of travelers.
Yeah, absolutely. So the robotics field is something that I think a lot of people, and I would say myself included, are sort of cautious about in terms of it's very challenging to get into, and you really have to really focus maybe all of your career around studying this type of technology. And just from an outside perspective, what are the maybe advice you can give for people who might be interested in trying to learn more about robotics? Do they have to start from like undergraduate studies, or they can actually jump in the middle of their career into that?
No, I don't think it's really something even today. So back when I started in engineering school, this is where I went to school at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. And the engineering programs in 1994 were pretty traditional. The newest one was computer science, but the rest of the engineering fields were the same: IE, EE, ME, PE, Chem-E, those petroleum as well. We had petroleum engineering. And of course, being in Texas, that was a big one. But really, those fields are, like robotics and a lot of other fields in general these days. Bioengineering is a good one, right? There's a mix of traditional engineering with biology. Robotics is a mix of electromechanical engineering, which is exactly what I said, electrical, the control side of it combined with the mechanical engineering side. And if you look at most disciplines, they're like that. Now, you can go study robotics. Controls engineering is now, I think, a focus at some of the universities. And I know universities like Cornell and MIT take a closer look at the electromechanical side of things. Mechatronics is really what they call it. I think University Santa Clara is one of the top mechatronics, along with Cornell these days. I mean, but really at the end of the day, it's like it just plants the seed of an idea. And I think these days, robotics is so close to the engineering education experience these days, because I know when I was working at my first company, Stoibli in South Carolina, we were donating robots to Clemson, for example. Mm-hmm. It's quite common for universities to have this interaction with robotics companies to get their students exposed to the concept of using robotic automation. But it's really a very basic and fundamental exposure, and it's really from that point, does that seed of an idea in a student's head get planted, so they go off and pursue other things, because it's really, once you get out into the industry where you can take that further. But hopefully in the university setting, they get the idea to go pursue perhaps a robotics company like I did to start out their career.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about robotics, there's, in your case, you're saying you come from a family of people who do sales and do this type of traveling, and you have, I guess, have gravitated, or rather maybe balanced, doing the robotics on yourself as an engineer, as well as doing the sales. So which one do you think you enjoy doing most, and why?
Well, I think when I first started in robotics, sales is not a career, I think, in general, for most people coming out of school.
Mm-hmm.
It adds a dynamic to the business that I don't think most green engineers coming out of school are going to be really engaged in. There's still a fascination with the technology itself, and the typical job that you come out of school with is applications engineering, because and believe it or not, application engineering is as much sales as sales is, because what you're doing is you're taking a customer's needs and you're turning that in, you're thinking about it, and you're considering it from the different angles, and the experience allows you to look at things at more angles, and that's the key. And you're figuring out, okay, how do I go from this problem that they want to solve to applying the product that I'm responsible for? If you're working for a commercial company, the idea is to get more of those products out into the market. Yeah. So you're pitching the product just as much as the frontline folks are in the sales process. So that's something I would stress, is that applications engineering in general in robotics is as much sales as anyone on the front lines. It's just a different aspect of it. Mm-hmm. And as if you're enthralled by that, if you really enjoy it, then you take that knowledge, and if you want to go make some money and go into sales, you can do that, and that's going to be the root of your skills as far as conveying that, because you're going to be doing it right in front of the customer. And that's the transition, right? And mm-hmm. for me, it's one and the same. When I'm sitting in front of a customer, I'm as much of an engineer as I'm a sales professional. They both have different needs. I'm serving different needs of the customer, and I'm serving different needs of my company that I'm representing. Mm-hmm. And it's really balancing those two things out. It's just really expanding on those horizons that you got experience with as an applications engineer, and now you're just opening up to a bigger piece of the business. And you have a much bigger responsibility for the sales process, mm-hmm. of course, and driving that. Mm-hmm. But it's fundamentally the same.
Yeah, it's very fascinating you say that, because when I was preparing for this podcast, I obviously looked up your title is Chief Sales Engineer, and I guess inherently I wasn't quite sure exactly how do you combine the sales and engineer. But now, like, when you say that, it makes perfect sense. Like, it's
sales is an engineering process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so. In terms of the robots, it's hardware plus software. Which one? What's the sort of perfect balance that makes a good robot? Like, and why?
Well, hardware is really a function of the application. So when I look at any robot application, I think, okay, do I need something that can pick up an engine block, or do I need something that can pick up, as is most of the time for me, a microtiter plate? One is, say 400 kilos. The other one is 500 grams maximum. Mm-hmm. So, that's the first kind of order of business, is to look at the mechanics and be upfront as to whether there's going to be a solution built around something I can offer. From there, it's now a function of what is the business model surrounding how the robot's going to be implemented. So, for example, robots end up in the real world in many different ways and through many different mechanisms. If you go to a car plant, most of those came from a systems integration company. So there's a custom system builder that takes a robot that has nothing on it and develops tooling completely specific to making one piece of a car. If you go into a car factory, almost every gripper on every robot is slightly different or majorly different, depending on what its purpose is. And that's a bespoke solution. And the result is you get this very organic apparatus at the end. It's a car. I mean, it's amazing. You can build a car with so much robotics and not so many people. And that's for good reason, because most of those processes are dangerous, handling heavy things or welding torches and things like that. But in my business is primarily handling a common shape. So it's a rectangle, it's a microtiter plate. So we're really just looking at, okay, can the robot work with all of the instruments necessary to complete a process? And that process could be anywhere from diagnostics, as we're seeing in the COVID-19 situation, to research and development. That's also related to the current situation as well, because pharmaceutical products are really products of years and years and thousands, tens of thousands of man hours of research, and the robots compress time for them. Right, so it's not doing something necessarily that's too dangerous most of the time, but handling blood samples is an exception to that. But most of the cases, it's not really taking danger out of the scenario. It's taking repetition, and it is impossible quantities of repetition. So what you can do with a robot arm and a system that fits in the corner of a room would take several roomfuls of people to do in a lot longer period of time. So it's not even a question of people versus robots. Yeah. You do it with a robot or you won't be in business. That's the simple, the simple approach. It's a different way to look at it. But, from there, it's just, once you mechanically figure out how the system's going to work and look like, software is important. What you want to do is spend as little time on the software as possible. You don't, developing robot code, maybe it sounds like good resume material, but when it comes to deployment, that's the thing that most organizations don't have the time in the whole system timeline to focus on. So we spend a lot of time focusing on how to minimize the amount of efforts used in software development.
Mm-hmm. And the robots, as you say, they have to occupy very small space in the laboratory, but oftentimes the question that I would have is how would they work alongside humans, or do they have to work separately? Like how do you guys address this type of problem that I think a lot of people may be a little bit skeptical about, like having a robot right next to you?
There's this term cobots or collaborative robots, and it's a very interesting concept that I've really focusing my career on, in fact. But there's a bit of a misnomer about what that means. And really, in most applications, a person is not working with a robot very much directly, because if they're doing that, then the robot's not really doing what it should be doing, right? Mm-hmm. But on the flip side of that, if you look at most environments that utilize heavy amounts of automation, and the car plant is the classic example, but go into a plant where they make shaving razors for, when you shave, right? I've been in these plants too. They're the same as a car factory, they're just smaller scale, right? Things are moving, you don't want to touch them, it's dangerous, you got sharp objects, and everything is completely enclosed in a box for a good reason. In a laboratory, that's a different case, right? When somebody walks up to an instrument and they want to use it, or they want to, let's say, service it and add fluids to it, reagents, whatever things that are accessories to the process that they have, if you ask them to shut everything down, close everything up, and then start opening doors with door locks, it starts to, maybe the robotics don't look as interesting anymore, because it becomes an ordeal just to do simple like refill a container. Mm-hmm. And so what the collaborative aspect provides for those customers is the robot doesn't really behave much differently from any instrument they've worked with since they were in college. Mm-hmm. So they started studying biology or the field that they're in. Mm-hmm. And that's really the difference there is they're not handling something heavy. It's usually not dangerous. Sometimes it is, and you have to have special considerations for that. But for the most part, these systems operate at an open laboratory. So why do anything different if you add a robot? And that's That's the key there. And then it's not even intimidating. It's just that's the robotic arm that moves the samples through the process. Nothing special, right? I mean, we don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about the robot because you just press pause, do your thing, or you just, sometimes you can just keep letting the robot run because what you're doing isn't going to affect what the robot's doing.
Absolutely. And in the process of, I guess, making the robot do what it's supposed to be doing, which is to shorten the man hours for repetitive tasks, would you say that there is actually a possibility where you can invent a better way of addressing these questions with a robot in terms of completely reinventing the workflow that it needs to be done to address a certain research question?
You just described I think the thing that gets me up in the morning with respect
Fantastic.
to my job, because well, that really is, so that's where the engineer never goes away, right? You're always engineering, and I have the benefit of having the bandwidth to see, things at a relatively top level. Granted, I'm not getting into too much of the details, certain cases I am, but at a high level, I get to see a lot more than most people get to see. I am, and again, always respecting the confidentiality of customers, but I'm really mainly speaking of trade shows, right, where people are showing off different approaches that they have, and of course, everybody's getting ideas, and taking ideas not only from those sources, and more importantly, from the customer, right, and just taking all that cumulative knowledge and applying it to something new for a unique proposition, a unique scenario that we want to solve. That's really the fun of it, because I've got the benefit of the bandwidth across the entire industry, but at the same time, being able to work individually with customers to utilize that knowledge to just bring it all together at the right time in the right place. And that's where I was going back, just going back to this whole transition from, let's say, applications engineer to sales professional, is if you've got that desire to continue doing that and doing it in a bigger scale, that's I think plants the seed for robotics, because robotics can be, even with a simple robot, it can be extraordinarily complicated to put it into a process, but experience will give you the knowledge you need to do it.
Absolutely. And we kind of bypassed a little bit how you jumped into the life science field and life science robotics specifically. So I'm curious to know, what was the motivation behind going into that specific direction versus, say, car manufacturing or other types of robotics?
Well, I had the opportunity, so it's not so uncommon that if you work at a company and you're a vendor to somebody, you might go work for that company. So I actually jumped from my first job to one of our customers, who was actually my customer that I managed, and it was an opportunity to get back into the engineering element a little bit, to bring a robot from just industrial robot arm, which is how it starts, to a surgical robotic system. Yeah. And so I stayed with that company 5 years. We took it from a prototype all the way to a marketed FDA cleared surgical robot device. It's a hair transplant device. But it uses a commercial robotic arm. And that's when I spent a lot of time at that company getting familiar with human-robot interaction. Now, not at the scientific level. I've got somebody I'm connected with on LinkedIn. She's studies different aspects of human-robot interaction at a very researchy scientific level. This was really just watching, trying to figure out how can we make this very hard to use tool for the typical doctor, at least, easy to use. And that's when I started thinking about, okay, what markets will this have the most prolific effect? And I think, collaborative robots, I think there's a lot of different opinions there. Different robot companies have different approaches, but I think life science is the ultimate application for this type of technology today. That could change, but and the reason being is because here you have an environment similar to physicians, where it's not super complicated to bring a collaborative robot experience to them. And since kind of discovering how far we can take it. We continue to take it further every day. That's when I realized this is the opportunity, I think, in the next 10, 15, perhaps beyond. But I'm just kind of looking at the 10-year timeline. I think life science will be one of the most interesting markets for robotics in the near term.
Absolutely. I saw a video that was from a hair transplant clinic highlighting this type of robot, and I didn't realize that you worked on it. I saw it fairly recently. So, and then it looks amazing, that robot, and how it's integrated into the pipeline of obviously addressing the hair transplantation issue. It's kind of amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and that really set the bar for me. I'm thinking, well, if we can take a commercial, nothing special about it. That's the same robot you could get to make your cell phone. Okay, same robot, to take that and put it into a clinical environment, and these things are all over the world. There's hundreds and hundreds of them, working with people who know nothing about robotics. If we can do that, I think we can make a real impact on life science, and that really was the basis of my leaving that company to do what I'm doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. With life science, I feel being in the academic lab, since I just finished my PhD, I always was fascinated. Like, I wish I could automate this type of thing that I'm doing in the lab or whatever. And I always felt like robots are just beyond the price point of an academia. At which point do you think this might change, where robots become such a commonplace, and like when does the price would start to go down?
Well, academia has always been a interesting side of things, because of course it's not a commercially driven acquisition, right? Anytime you're acquiring technology to go into that space, I think, in my experience, the price point of the types of technologies around automation have been driven down significantly just in my 22 years I've been in the industry. I remember a robot that was maybe 600 millimeters in reach, 6-axis. That thing was over $60,000 when I started. You can get one of those for 20, maybe less today. I think that's pretty amazing. So I don't really think it's the cost of the technology, I think, is asymptotically getting to a point where you're not going to get much lower. And I think that has a lot to do with, look, it's made out of metal, and it's made out of bearings, and it has a certain amount of wiring and costs, just based on even mass manufacturing. It's that cost reduction from $60,000 to $20,000 in 22 years is pretty amazing if you think about something where the volumes haven't gone up nearly the multipliers from, let's say, 94 when I joined, or 98 when I joined, to today, compared to the number of cell phones that have been sold annually. And the relative cost difference, frankly, a cell phone, it's got more features, but it's about the same price as a basic cell phone back then. So I don't, I think it's a relative thing. Capital equipment is always being driven for cost reduction. Capital equipment companies, it's kind of the bane of their existence, right? We have to make more money with less margin, or less, the lower price, and then that means you have to sell a lot more. And the robot industry just hasn't grown like that. In fact, it shrank in some instances along the way, especially certain markets. The automotive market still continues to be the pulse of robotics. So if you look at all the different industries that robots are used, the car industry drives it the most. And if you think about the car industry, how many times has it been in kind of a little bit of a depressed state? Like right now, is about the best time you could buy a car in the last 10 years, I think.
Okay, I should be on the lookout then.
Yeah, go get a car, because they are offering deals like crazy because nobody's buying them.
Absolutely. Actually, in terms of the pace of robotics innovation and sort of this market saturation, do you think that now that we enter maybe a new phase in terms of how much innovation would be coming out in the next few years, especially as a result of this push through the COVID-19 epidemic, or it's actually it's going to be more of a linear progression going forward?
Well, we're certainly going to be seeing a spike. I can tell you we're seeing it right now. The demand for robotics to handle samples is unparalleled right now in the life science market. So you're going to see a tremendous spike. It's going to continue to grow. We're going to see the spike here locally in the time we're in now, but it's going to continue to grow. And I think a lot of it has to do with the COVID-19 specifically. Number one, research capacity has been planned in most companies, right? They've had plans to increase capacity for research applications, right? To look at new things. That's always something that's in the budget for most of these companies, because the more research throughput you have as a pharmaceutical company, then that opens up more opportunities to bring something to market. Because you know how you've heard this in the news, I'm sure, how long it takes to bring any product, if you will, in life science to market. If it's a drug, you got to research it, then you got to test it, then you got to test it again, and then you have to do trials, and it's a long time frame. So you need to have a pipeline, and your research capacity is part of that pipeline. And it is a fact that it's harder and harder to find new chemistries, biological solutions. Now we've got different. I'm being very broad here. There's a lot of different areas of life science research, but the general trend is it's getting harder and harder to find new things in pharmaceutical research. So you need more capacity, just like a car plant. Basically, you need to have, or like paint, more paint to throw on the wall. It's an educated throw, but you need more there. And there's different projects where they're trying to optimize for certain research fields on how fast you can come to a meaningful result, so you can decide to continue or deviate from there. But the fact is, you need more research capacity at the end of the day. And on the other side of it, the COVID-19 specific surge we're seeing now is mainly around the diagnostic side, right? One thing COVID-19 has shown us around the world is we just don't have enough diagnostic capacity to get the job done, right? They came up with the reagents to do the actual antibody test or the COVID-19 test, varying degrees of accuracy across the whole market. That's not my area of expertise, but that's something that's there. But regardless of that, capacity wasn't there, right? To be able to produce test results as fast as necessary, assuming you have the appropriate test to try or to run for a patient. And so it's kind of like places with crumbling roads, right? You wonder why the trucks don't get places on time. Well, it's because we our roads are out of whack, and all of a sudden, when you need all the trucks, all of a sudden the roads get fixed, and that's what's happening now. Is a big backfill of all this capacity that's needed for if pandemics like this are going to be a modern problem, which it sounds like it is, then you need to have the infrastructure in place to be able to test, so you can keep things stabilized and not shut down the economy quite as long, or at least do it in a more educated fashion.
Mm-hmm. It seems like the likes of Tekken and Hamilton will just have a really a field day for many months to come.
Yes and no. I mean, certainly a lot of assays are produced on liquid handling platforms. There's a lot of that back-end technology of pipetting is a fairly small group of companies, and I know, for sure they're doing quite well, because there's a lot of modern assays and assay types that can be run directly on a liquid handler, or need the support of a liquid handler. Let's say a bigger robotic system like PCR stuff. You need a robot to attach to all that, but you're right, they're going to do quite well in that sense. But there's a lot of other things that are growing beyond that, because those are general purpose instruments, and they can do a lot of different things. You can focus their use, but a lot of diagnostic instrumentation, the goal is to make it fit in as many places as possible, And sometimes having a liquid handling deck isn't necessarily ideal if you've just got a small lab. I mean, what if you could get your COVID-19 test on a small benchtop system that not only tests COVID-19, but also tests, 100 different other things, or maybe a single purpose instrument that can run a PCR or something like that, where you insert and they fit on a benchtop, There's a lot of other instrumentation businesses that are, of course, seeing a huge growth right now because of it.
When did you really experience the epiphany of, okay, this is going to be a lot more business and I'm going to be a lot busier for the many, many months to come? Like, when did that really hit you? Was that in February or January, perhaps?
No, actually, it was last year, because when they started talking about this stuff, it was a virus and just a general demand of PCR, even if it wasn't something that went, it didn't really go global. It was starting to show up later in the year, but it wasn't really something that we were all talking about until really February. Mm-hmm. Things kind of hit in March here in the US. But that's the thing, is the extent, the reach of our, the robotics business is way beyond the just our locality here where I'm located, right? It's a global thing. And, you could just kind of get the sense that, okay, we need to start doing, putting some DNA sequencing into this, and we're going to, because understanding a virus, every year that goes by, we're able to understand these things sooner. And so when they figured this thing out, they started sequencing it right away. And that's because we have just general availability of sequencing technology that we didn't have 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in 10 years before that, it was very basic, right? They were, they just barely sequenced the human genome, and the technology wasn't there to make it even viable to do it twice. Well, we can do it once, we can't do it twice. Yeah. Now you can just do it over, a couple of hours, So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Big change there. But I could see the signs, not leading to what we got now, but I could just see the signs that things were, people were looking at things more closely.
Yeah. As we wrap up our podcast, one of the things we mentioned was some of the things that keeps that basically you get up in the morning and you sort of want to address these robotics questions. But what are the maybe challenges and the things that maybe keep you up at night that in this type of field where we talk about Terminators in the beginning of our talk, and now the robotics? Is there anything that you may be skeptical about or just concerned about in your job?
Well, I'm not holding my breath for Terminators or AIs that go nuts, other than making my coffee machine do the wrong things at the wrong time. That's about as nuts as your AI, I think, is going to get in the near future, or producing ridiculous results like it is now, in fact. Mm-hmm. AI is having a hard time digesting the way human beings are behaving while there's a pandemic. Yeah, that's because AIs don't have any data to deal with about pandemics. Yeah. They've got no guidance, right, on what's right or wrong. So AI is already basically, for the most part, well, in many ways, collapsed in its usefulness in the state of a pandemic.
That's a very bold statement, by the way.
Well, I mean, it's look, people are if you're questioning your AI, what are you telling your customers to do, right? If they're relying on AI. Now, it's not, it's just basically a dent. That's the purpose of AI, right? It learns, mm-hmm. and it adapts, right? Well, we're just, you just got to still recognize and point out, this is a time where it's learning and we're getting more data on how people are behaving. If it's an AI that's built around human behavior stuff, modeling, things like that. I'm not holding my breath for self-driving cars either. And that's one of those where I've always found that to be kind of just Bay Area, Silicon Valley. Let's do this, and it sounds great, but it's one of those things where I don't see that being solved anywhere more than, let's say, 99% of the way in the next 40, 50 years. And do you really want a car that's 99% driving well on its own? Not so much,
Not really.
Again, I mean, it's just thinking through these things. They sound great. So I'm kind of glad that that's actually going by the wayside for a lot of folks that have decided to invest in that. And they're spending more time on problems that we can solve today, which is for example, AI for better decision-making around safety, right? That's an area where AI has always been questioned, right? But there's, I think, a lot of work that can be done on improving the way humans interact with things in general, including the safety aspects of things, right? And including looking at trends on where, oh, this is going to go off the rails. Because imagine a computer has so much power. If it has the right data and the right inputs, it can have decision making much faster. So safety systems for cars, for example, detecting a person, detecting a ball, and figuring out and helping the person mitigate what those things what different events could happen. And that's the element of self-driving, if you will. It's not really self-driving, but that's the element where I combine those two, AI and self-driving. Let's put the self-driving thing on the back burner. Let's focus on what better value can we add to the human machine experience for whatever it is, you name it, whether it's interacting with machinery, interacting with robotics and used in your day-to-day work, or interacting with a machine that a lot of people get in every day, a car, right? And that's where I think a lot of those things can help. But as far as keeping me up at night, it's really just getting enough machines out there, because they're really heavily needed, right? I mean, that's like, being able to get the machinery and the robots in the right place to kind of, help folks get their head wrapped around the situation and future situations like this.
Yeah, I guess the final question is, so do you have now a BMW?
I don't. I kind of lost my, so one of the problems with spending a lot of times in car factories, I can tell you, is they all start looking the same. And when you see cars without paint, and I've seen them all, Porsches, Renaults in France, or you go to Germany, Mercedes, BMW, you name it. It's hard to tell the difference, other than, okay, that's a sedan, that's a coupe. A Porsche is pretty distinguished, can't miss that. But unless it's a Ferrari or something like that, you really just don't. It's just, I don't know. I became less involved in it, but I did make sure that the license plate was a right match for me. Since I went to Texas Tech, my license plate is ROBOT space TX. And if you say that really fast, it's Robot TX. And it sounds like robotics.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. It's a real pleasure.
My pleasure, Pavel. Thank you for having me.